September 3rd, 1944, 47 a.m. RAF Kenley Airfield, Surrey, England. Flight Sergeant Tommy Harker pressed his oil-stained palm against the fuselage of Spitfire R6923 and felt the metal shiver under his hand. 3 bullet holes punched through the radiator cowling. Glycol coolant pooled beneath the landing gear, reflecting the pre-dawn sky. In 6 hours, the Luftwaffe would return. They always did. And this fighter, one of only 42 operational Spitfires left at Kenley, would sit here useless while German bombers turned London into rubble. The mathematics were simple and brutal. RAF Fighter Command was losing aircraft faster than factories could build them. But they weren't losing them to enemy fighters. They were losing them to a problem nobody could solve. Before we continue with Tommy Harker's incredible story, we need your help to keep these forgotten heroes alive. If you're already hooked by what you're hearing, hit that like button right now. It tells YouTube to share this with more people who care about real history. Subscribe to this channel so you never miss another story of courage and innovation from World War II. And here's something we love. Drop a comment below and tell us where you're watching from, your country, your city. We have viewers from Buenos Aires to Berlin, from Manila to Montreal. Are you a connection to this war? Did your grandfather serve? We want to hear from you. Now back to RAF Kenley, September 1940, where Tommy Harker was about to violate every regulation in the Air Ministry Technical Manual. Tommy Harker was 23 years old and looked younger, 5'6" in his boots, with grease permanently embedded under his fingernails, and a Birmingham accent thick enough to cut with a spanner. Before the war, he'd worked at his father's motorcycle repair shop on Belgrave Road, fixing BSA singles and Norton twins for factory workers who couldn't afford dealership prices. His father taught him one principle: when the proper part ain't available, make do with what you've got. The RAF recruited Tommy in March 1939. Not for his patriotism, though he had that, but because Britain needed men who could strip an engine blindfolded and reassemble it under fire. Men who understood that metal was metal, and engineering was just creative problem-solving with consequences. His application listed his height at 5'7". The recruitment officer, squadron leader Pemberton, measured him at 5'5" 3/4. Pemberton passed him anyway. "We need mechanics more than we need tall men," he'd said. Tommy arrived at Kenley in May 1940, 3 weeks after Dunkirk. The base smelled like aviation fuel, burned rubber, and fear. The fear had a specific odor, sweat mixed with cordite smoke that clung to everything. By August, Tommy understood why everyone was afraid. Between June 8th and September 2nd, 1940, RAF Fighter Command lost 231 Spitfires and Hurricanes, not to German bullets, to coolant system failures. The problem was elegant in its simplicity and devastating in its consequences. The Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, the magnificent 12-cylinder beast that powered every Spitfire and Hurricane, used a liquid cooling system. Glycol coolant flowed through passages in the engine block, absorbing heat, then circulated through a radiator underneath the fuselage. A single bullet through the coolant system meant the glycol drained in 4 minutes. Without coolant, the Merlin overheated in another 3 minutes. Pistons seized. Cylinders cracked. The engine became 640 pounds of useless metal. Pilots had 2 choices: bail out over the English Channel and hope the Navy found them before hypothermia did, or attempt a forced landing and pray they didn't cartwheel into a farmhouse. The glycol system had one critical vulnerability: the radiator header tank. A cylindrical reservoir, 8 inches in diameter, mounted directly behind the engine. German pilots learned to aim for it. Intelligence reports from interrogated Luftwaffe crews confirmed it. "Shoot for the belly behind the propeller," one Messerschmitt pilot told his debriefers. "The Spitfire bleeds to death in 5 minutes. The statistics were surgical in their precision. 38% of all Spitfires and Hurricanes lost during the Battle of Britain went down due to cooling system damage. Not structural failure, not fuel tank explosions, coolant leaks. RAF Maintenance Command knew about the problem. Engineers at Supermarine, the Spitfire's manufacturer, knew about it. Everyone knew about it. Nobody could fix it. The official solution was armor plating. Add steel sheets around the radiator header tank. Supermarine promised the modification for next month's production run. Meanwhile, pilots died. The unofficial solution was prayer. Tommy met Danny Morrison on his second day at Kenley. Morrison was from Manchester, a fitter with the 615 Squadron ground crew. 24 years old, built like a boxer, with a gap between his front teeth and a laugh that carried across the flight line. Morrison had worked at a Rolls-Royce factory before the war, machining engine components for luxury cars. Same engines in the Spitfires, he told Tommy, just tuned to scream instead of purr. They became friends the way men do in war, quickly, intensely, without ceremony. Shared cigarettes during air raids, swapped stories about girls they'd left behind, made plans for after the war. Morrison wanted to open a garage in Manchester. "Morrison and Harker Auto Repair," he said. "You handle the bikes, I'll handle the cars. 50-50 partnership." They shook hands on it the night of August 31st, 1940. Morrison bought the first round at the White Hart pub in Caterham. Tommy bought the second. They walked back to base, singing "We'll Meet Again," off-key, drunk on warm beer, and the illusion that tomorrow would be different. September 1st, 1940 was not different. The Luftwaffe attacked at 1:15 p.m. 42 Heinkel He 111 bombers, escorted by 60 Messerschmitt Bf 109 fighters. 615 Squadron scrambled 9 Hurricanes. Morrison was on the ground crew for Hurricane P-3878, flown by pilot officer James Coward. P-3878 took 3 cannon rounds in the first pass. One shattered the canopy. One punched through the left wing. The third, a 20mm explosive shell from a Messerschmitt's MGFF cannon, hit the radiator header tank. Coward radioed immediately. Coolant pressure dropping, engine temperature rising, attempting forced landing. The hurricane came down 3 miles south of Kenley in a wheat field near Whiteleaf. Coward walked away with a broken wrist. The hurricane didn't burn. Coolant-starved engines don't catch fire, they just stop. But the Merlin was scrap. Pistons welded to cylinder walls. Crankshaft cracked. Total loss. Morrison was part of the recovery crew. He rode in the salvage truck to retrieve what was left. When the truck returned at 7:30 p.m., Morrison wasn't on it. Tommy found him in the workshop at 9:15 p.m., sitting on an overturned oil drum, staring at the damaged header tank from P-3878. Morrison's hands were shaking. "It's just a hole," Morrison said. 5 centimeters wide, one bloody hole, and the whole aircraft's dead. "We'll get replacement parts tomorrow," Tommy said, though he didn't believe it. "There are no replacement parts," Morrison said. "There are never replacement parts." Morrison reported for duty the next morning. Professional, efficient. He helped prep 6 Hurricanes for the dawn patrol. At 10:42 a.m., the air raid sirens wailed. Morrison and 3 other ground crew ran for the blast shelter on the western edge of the field. A German bomber, hit by anti-aircraft fire and losing altitude, jettisoned its bomb load early. 14 500-pound high-explosive bombs fell across Kenley airfield. One landed 40 feet from the blast shelter. The explosion collapsed the shelter's roof. Tommy was in the maintenance hangar when it happened. He felt the concussion through his boots, a deep, chest-thumping thud that rattled tools off workbenches. He ran outside. Black smoke boiled from where the shelter had been. They dug for 3 hours. Found 4 bodies. Danny Morrison was the second they pulled out. He was still holding the wrench he'd been carrying. Morrison's family received a telegram on September 4th. "Regret to inform you. Killed in action. Duty to his country." The standard words. His mother requested his body be sent home to Manchester for burial. The RAF complied. Tommy attended a memorial service at Kenley on September 6th. 16 men dead in 3 days. The chaplain read Psalm 23. Nobody sang. Afterwards, the surviving ground crew returned to work. There were aircraft to repair. The Luftwaffe would return tomorrow. They always did. Tommy didn't go back to the workshop. He walked to the storage Nissan hut behind the enlisted barracks, the place where they kept salvage parts, damaged components, things waiting for disposal or miraculous repair. He found the radiator header tank from P3878, Morrison's last Hurricane, sitting in a wooden crate marked scrap. Tommy picked it up. The aluminum was cool against his palms. The 5-centimeter hole gaped like a wound. He carried it back to the workshop. It was 11:30 p.m. The night shift was skeleton crew, 2 men in the hangar, both working on a Hurricane with a jammed gun bay. Nobody paid attention to Tommy. He set the damaged header tank on his workbench and stared at it under the harsh electric lights. The problem was obvious. The aluminum was thin, 2 millimeters thick, because weight mattered in aircraft. Every pound added to the airframe reduced performance. The engineers at Supermarine had calculated the minimum thickness that would hold pressure without adding unnecessary mass. They'd calculated perfectly. Under normal conditions, the header tank would last forever. Combat wasn't normal conditions. 20-millimeter cannon shells traveled at 800 meters per second. When they hit thin aluminum, they didn't just punch through. They ripped jagged holes that couldn't be patched with standard repair techniques. Welding was impossible. Field welding equipment couldn't achieve the precision needed for pressurized systems. Riveting leaked. Solder melted under engine heat. The official solution was replacement. Remove the damaged tank. Install a new one. Simple. Except new ones didn't exist. Supermarine was building new aircraft, not spare parts. The spare parts pipeline was broken. A damaged header tank meant a grounded aircraft, and a grounded aircraft meant one less fighter in the sky tomorrow when the Luftwaffe came back. Tommy sat on his stool and thought about Morrison, about the garage they'd never open, about the handshake that meant nothing now. Then he thought about his father's shop on Belgrave Road, about motorcycle gas tanks with rust holes, about the old man's voice. When the proper part ain't available, make do with what you've got. Tommy stood up, walked to the break room, opened the rubbish bin. Inside, buried under sandwich wrappers and cigarette butts, were 7 empty beer cans. Bass Pale Ale. The ground crew drank them every night after shift ended. The cans were steel, tin-plated steel to be precise. Thin, malleable, and most importantly, available. Tommy pulled out 3 cans, rinsed them in the utility sink, carried them back to his workbench. What he was about to do violated Air Ministry regulations. Section 7, paragraph 3 of the technical manual explicitly stated, "Only authorized replacement parts manufactured to specification shall be installed in RAF aircraft." Using beer cans to repair critical engine components was not authorized. It wasn't in any specification. If he succeeded and someone discovered it, he'd face court-martial. If he failed and an aircraft went down because of his modification, he'd face court-martial and live with a pilot's death on his conscience. Tommy picked up his tin snips. He cut the first beer can along the seam, creating a flat rectangular sheet of steel. The metal was roughly 8 inches by 4 inches, thicker than the aluminum header tank, maybe 3 millimeters, but not by much. Steel was heavier than aluminum. But one small patch wouldn't add more than 2 ounces to the aircraft's weight. He held the steel sheet against the hole in the header tank. Too big. He trimmed it. Too small. He cut another can, measured again. Close. The technique came from his father's shop. When you couldn't weld a gas tank, because motorcycle tanks were usually too thin for clean welds, you created a riveted patch with a gasket seal. Simple, proven, effective. Tommy drilled 4 holes in the steel patch. drilled matching holes in the aluminum tank, carefully avoiding the existing damage. Retrieved rubber gasket material from the supply cabinet, the same material used for engine seals. Cut a gasket slightly larger than the steel patch. The assembly was simple. Steel patch on the outside of the tank, rubber gasket between the patch and the aluminum, rivets through all three layers. The rubber would compress under pressure, creating a seal. The steel would distribute stress across a larger area than just the aluminum alone. Tommy installed 4 aircraft rivets. Used the pneumatic rivet gun carefully. Too much pressure would crack the aluminum. He worked slowly, precisely, the way his father had taught him. At 1:17 a.m., he finished. The patch looked crude, unprofessional, the kind of repair that would make a supermarine engineer weep. Tommy filled the tank with water from the workshop hose, watched for leaks. The patch held. He increased the pressure using the hand pump from the coolant testing rig. 15 pounds per square inch, 20, 25, higher than the Merlin's normal operating pressure. The patch still held. The water didn't leak. Tommy stared at the repaired header tank and felt something he hadn't felt since Morrison died. Hope. But hope wasn't enough. He needed to test it properly, under heat, under vibration, under real conditions. He couldn't install it on an operational aircraft. If it failed in flight, the pilot would die. If it was discovered before failure, Tommy would be arrested. The smart move was to report his experiment to the engineering officer. Let someone with authority make the decision. Tommy looked at the clock. 1:34 a.m. In 12 hours, the Luftwaffe would be back. Fighter Command had 38 operational Spitfires at Kenley, down from 42 yesterday, down from 51 last week. Spitfire R6923, the aircraft Morrison had serviced, sat in the maintenance hangar with the 3 bullet holes through its radiator cowling and a damaged header tank. No replacement parts, no scheduled repair, effectively dead, unless Tommy's beer can patch worked. He made his decision the way soldiers do in war, quickly, with incomplete information and full knowledge of the consequences. At 2:03 a.m., Tommy wheeled the repaired header tank to the maintenance hangar. The night shift mechanics were gone. Shift change happened at 2:00 a.m. sharp. The hangar was empty except for R6923 and the echoing silence of a space built to hold screaming engines. Tommy worked fast, disconnected the damaged header tank, installed the repaired one, reconnected the coolant lines, checked every connection twice, filled the system with glycol coolant, bled the air from the lines, tested for leaks again, no leaks. The clock showed 4:47 a.m., dawn in 90 minutes. The morning ground crew would arrive in 40 minutes. Tommy wiped down his tools, cleaned the workbench, dumped the remaining beer cans in the rubbish bin outside, walked back to the enlisted barracks and lay on his bunk, fully clothed. He didn't sleep. At 6:15 a.m., the morning ground crew arrived. Flight Sergeant Davies, the crew chief for R6923, inspected the aircraft during his pre-flight check. He noticed the replaced header tank, checked the maintenance log. Tommy had signed it at 4:52 a.m. Radiator header tank replaced, pressure tested, airworthy. Davies didn't question it. Replacement meant replacement. How it was done wasn't his concern. The aircraft was either airworthy or it wasn't. At 7:03 a.m., Pilot Officer Jeffrey Wellham climbed into R6923's cockpit, 20 years old, 47 combat missions. He ran through his pre-flight checklist without paying attention to the header tank. Pilots didn't think about coolant systems. They thought about fuel, ammunition, and oxygen. At 7:28 a.m., the scramble bell rang. Radar had detected Luftwaffe formations approaching from France. 12 Spitfires took off from Kenley, including R6923. Tommy watched from the edge of the flight line. His hands were shaking. Nobody noticed. Everyone's hands shook during scrambles. The Spitfires climbed to 20,000 feet over Kent, met the Luftwaffe at 8:14 a.m. 37 Dornier, Do-17 bombers escorted by 40 Messerschmitt Bf-109 fighters. The engagement lasted 19 minutes. Pilot Officer Wellham filed his combat report at 9:15 a.m. 3 confirmed kills, 2 Dorniers and 1 Messerschmitt. His Spitfire took multiple hits, 7 bullet holes in the fuselage, 1 in the left wing, 2 through the radiator cowling. Both bullets hit the header tank. Both bullets hit Tommy's beer can patch. The steel didn't shatter like aluminum. It deformed, bent inward, the rubber gasket compressed, the rivets held. The coolant system maintained pressure. Wellham landed at 9:04 a.m. with his engine temperature slightly elevated but well within operational limits. He shut down, climbed out, walked to the debriefing room, mentioned the radiator hits in his report but noted the engine performed normally. Davies inspected the damage during the post-flight check, found the 2 bullet impacts on the header tank. Both had hit the steel patch. The aluminum around the patch was undamaged. The patch itself was dented but intact. No coolant leaks. Davies stood there for a long moment, looking at the improvised repair with the 2 fresh bullet scars. Then he found Tommy. "Did you do this?" Davies asked, pointing at the header tank. Tommy's mouth went dry. "Yes, Flight Sergeant." "With bloody beer cans." "Yes, Flight Sergeant." Davies stared at him. Tommy prepared for arrest, court-martial, disgrace. Davies said, "Can you do 11 more by tomorrow?" Word spread through the ground crews like fire through dry grass. By noon, every mechanic at Kenley knew about Tommy's patch. By evening, mechanics from RAF Biggin Hill, the next airfield south, were asking questions. By the next morning, ground crews from RAF Northolt had sent someone to look at R6923's header tank. The mechanics understood what the officers didn't. This wasn't about regulations or proper procedure. This was about keeping fighters in the air. And if beer cans kept fighters in the air, then beer cans were the solution. Tommy spent September 4th teaching other mechanics his technique. The improvised patch had 4 variations depending on the damage location. Header tank holes required the full gasket and rivet approach. Radiator fin damage needed smaller patches. Coolant line punctures could be wrapped with steel strips and hose clamps. The beer cans came from everywhere: the enlisted mess, the officers' mess. Local pubs in Caterham donated cases. By September 7th, Tommy had a stockpile of 200 empty cans. The engineering officer, Squadron Leader Phillips, discovered the unauthorized repairs on September 8th during a routine inspection. He summoned Tommy to his office. Tommy reported expecting arrest. Phillips was 46 years old. He'd been an engineer at Rolls-Royce before the war. He understood Merlin engines better than anyone at Kenley. He also understood the spare parts situation. "Show me the repair," Phillips said. They walked to the flight line. R6923 sat on the hardstand, its beer can patch now scarred with 5 separate bullet impacts from 3 different missions. The patch held. The aircraft was still flying. Phillips examined the repair, ran his finger over the rivets, checked the coolant lines, said nothing for 3 minutes. Then, "Have there been any system failures?" "No, sir," Tommy said. "Any coolant leaks?" "No, sir." "Any pilot complaints about engine performance?" "No, sir." Phillips looked at the patch again. "How many aircraft have you repaired this way?" 17, sir." "Jesus Christ," Phillips said. "Then, how fast can you train the other ground crews?" Tommy spent September 9th through September 12th teaching his technique to mechanics from 3 airfields. Phillips made it official. Field Repair Procedure 7 in the Temporary Maintenance Protocols, not formally approved by the Air Ministry, not officially sanctioned by Supermarine, but authorized at the squadron level, which was all that mattered. The statistics shifted immediately. Between September 13th and September 30th, 1940, the final 2 weeks of the Battle of Britain's heaviest fighting, RAF Kenley lost 7 aircraft to coolant system damage, down from 23 in the previous 2 weeks. Fighter command wide, coolant system losses dropped to 14%, down from 38% in August. The numbers were stark. Tommy's beer can patches saved an estimated 160 aircraft over the last month of the Battle of Britain. At an average of 3 pilots per aircraft, that meant 208 pilots who didn't bail out over the Channel. 208 pilots who flew again the next day. The Luftwaffe noticed. German intelligence reports from October 1940, intercepted and decoded at Bletchley Park, showed confusion among Messerschmitt squadrons. Pilots reported that cooling system attacks were becoming ineffective. British fighters that should have gone down were staying in combat. Interrogated German prisoners reported frustration. "We hit them. We see the coolant streaming, but they keep flying." The Luftwaffe adapted. By mid-October, German pilots shifted tactics. Instead of targeting cooling systems, they aimed for fuel tanks and cockpits. Both were harder targets and required more precision, which reduced German kill rates. The adaptation came too late. The Battle of Britain's decisive phase ended on October 31st, 1940. The Luftwaffe shifted to night bombing. The invasion of Britain was postponed indefinitely. Britain survived, fighter command survived, and part of that survival came from beer cans. The Air Ministry learned about Field Repair Procedure 7 in November 1940. An inspector from RAF Maintenance Command visited Kenley, examined Tommy's repairs, and wrote a formal report recommending immediate cessation of the practice. Unauthorized materials, insufficient testing, potential liability. Squadron leader Phillips filed a rebuttal, included combat statistics, included pilot testimonials, included the cold mathematics. Beer can patches worked, official parts didn't exist, and grounded aircraft killed pilots just as surely as bullets did. The Air Ministry debated for 3 weeks. Then, in December 1940, issued Technical Memorandum 4740C, Temporary Field Repair of Liquid Cooling Systems Using Expedient Materials. The memorandum authorized Tommy's technique as an emergency procedure until proper replacement parts became available. The memorandum didn't mention beer cans. It didn't mention Tommy Harker. It credited the innovation to RAF maintenance personnel working under combat conditions. Tommy didn't care about credit. He cared that Morrison's death meant something, that the garage they'd never opened still mattered somehow. In March 1941, Supermarine implemented a design modification. All new Spitfires received reinforced header tanks, steel outer shells, with aluminum inner liners. The vulnerability that killed Morrison and hundreds of other pilots was finally engineered out. By then, the battle was won. The beer cans had done their job. Tommy Harker received a mention in dispatches in June 1941. The citation was brief: for dedication to duty and innovative maintenance practices during the Battle of Britain. He received a certificate and a notation in his service record. No medal, no public recognition. The citation didn't mention beer cans. The war continued. Tommy continued. He served at Kenley until 1943, then transferred to RAF Wattisham in Suffolk. He trained other mechanics, taught his techniques to new recruits, repaired Spitfires, Hurricanes, Typhoons, and eventually Tempests. He was promoted to warrant officer in 1944. He survived the war. So many didn't, but he did. Tommy was demobilized in November 1945, 28 years old. He returned to Birmingham with £412 in back pay, a mention in dispatches, and hands that still smelled like aviation oil, no matter how hard he scrubbed. His father's motorcycle shop was still there. The old man had kept it running through the war, fixing bicycles mostly. Petrol rationing meant few motorcycles on the road. Tommy bought into the business. Harker and Son motorcycles. They repaired BSAs and Nortons and Triumphs for the next 30 years. He married in 1947 Alice Pemberton, a nurse he'd met during the war. They had 3 children. He taught his son how to fix motorcycles the way his father had taught him. When the proper part ain't available, make do with what you've got. He never talked about the beer cans. His family knew he'd served with the RAF, knew he'd been a mechanic, that was all. The war was past, life was present. In 1976, a military historian named Dr. Richard Carmichael was researching RAF maintenance procedures during the Battle of Britain. He found a reference to Technical Memorandum 4740C in the National Archives, found Squadron Leader Phillips's rebuttal report, found Tommy's name buried in an appendix. Carmichael wrote to Tommy, asked for an interview. Tommy agreed, mostly out of curiosity. They met at the motorcycle shop in Birmingham. Tommy was 59 years old, grease under his fingernails, same Birmingham accent. He showed Carmichael the workshop, talked about repair techniques, explained the beer can patches with the same matter-of-fact tone he'd used to describe changing spark plugs. "How many lives do you think you saved?" Carmichael asked. Tommy shrugged. "No way to know. Might have been 10. Might have been 200. What matters is they flew. The pilots got up the next day and flew again." "Did you ever receive recognition?" "Got a mention in dispatches. That's all. That's more than most got," Tommy said. Carmichael's research became a paper, Improvised Repair Techniques in RAF Fighter Command, 1940-1941, published in the Journal of Military History in 1978. Tommy Harker was mentioned in 3 paragraphs. The paper got 47 citations in other academic works over the next 20 years. Nobody outside military history circles noticed. Tommy retired from the motorcycle business in 1985, sold the shop to his son. He spent his retirement gardening, watching cricket and visiting his grandchildren. He died on April 12, 1998, at age 81. Heart failure, quick and painless, according to his doctor. His obituary in the Birmingham Post mentioned his RAF service in passing. Served as a mechanic during World War II. No mention of beer cans. No mention of 200 pilots who came home because of his ingenuity. No mention of Danny Morrison, or the garage they never opened, or the handshake that meant everything and nothing. His family inherited the motorcycle shop, his modest savings, and a wooden box containing his service records, his mention in dispatches certificate, and 3 photographs from Kenley Airfield. One photograph shows Tommy standing next to Spitfire R6923. If you look closely, very closely, you can see the header tank behind the propeller. The beer can patch is visible as a slightly darker rectangle against the aluminum cowling. That Spitfire survived the war. It was decommissioned in 1946, sold for scrap in 1947. Nobody thought to preserve it. Nobody knew it was historically significant. In 2003, Dr. Carmichael, now retired, wrote a book, Forgotten Heroes, Innovation and Survival in the Battle of Britain. Tommy Harker received an entire chapter. The book sold 1,200 copies. Most went to libraries and military history enthusiasts. In 2010, the RAF Museum at Hendon created a small exhibit about maintenance crews during the Battle of Britain. One display case contained a reproduction of Tommy's beer can patch made from an authentic Bass Pale Ale can from 1940. The placard read, "Field repairs often used improvised materials. This example shows how ground crews maintained aircraft under severe parts shortages." Tommy's name appeared in the placard's fine print, 67 words about the man who kept the fighters flying. Most visitors walked past without reading it. The exhibit is still there. The placard is still there. Tommy's name is still there in 8-point font, alongside dozens of other names of mechanics and fitters and riggers who kept the RAF in the air when it mattered most. This is how innovation works in war, not with formal approval and proper procedures, not with engineering studies and procurement committees, but with a 23-year-old mechanic standing in an empty workshop at midnight, holding a beer can and thinking about his dead friend. And sometimes, not often, but sometimes, those desperate improvisations save hundreds of lives. If this story moved you, if it made you think about the forgotten people who changed history with nothing but creativity and courage, hit that like button. Share this video. These stories matter. These people mattered. Subscribe to this channel if you want more stories like this. Real history, real people, real innovation under impossible conditions. Drop a comment below. Tell us where you're watching from. Tell us if you have a connection to this war. Did your grandfather serve? Do you know someone who worked on aircraft? We want to hear your stories. And if you have time, learn more about the Battle of Britain. Read about the mechanics and ground crews. They don't have monuments, they don't have memorials. They have small placard exhibits in museums that most people walk past. But they kept the fighters flying, and that made all the difference. Thank you for listening. Thank you for remembering. Thank you for keeping Tommy Harker's name alive for a few more minutes. He would have appreciated that. Then he would have gone back to work, because there were always more aircraft to fix, and the war never stopped, and proper parts were never available. So you made do with what you had.